Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend a very timely and important lecture called Protecting Academic Freedom, Empowering Muslim Students After the Hamline Controversy. My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a professor of law, chancellor social justice scholar at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School, that has historically and always been committed to social justice. I also have the privilege of being the executive director of the Center for Security, Race and Rights, and also a faculty affiliate with the Eagleton Center for Politics at Rutgers University. That has the Center for Security, Race and Rights and the Eagleton Center for Politics are the co-sponsors of this event. And today we have two distinguished speakers that we're so honored to have join us today. And before I introduce them, Dr. Tamara Sears and Dr. Asifa Qureshi-Landis, let me just quickly put a pitch for the Center for Security, Race and Rights. It is the only and the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses primarily on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the United States through an interracial, interfaith, and interdisciplinary approach. And for that reason, we also look at the geopolitics of the various parts of the world wherein Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians have immigrated from, and also looking at the unique experiences of African-American Muslims. And we are always welcoming your support, so I encourage you to look at our website, csrr.rutgers.edu. Use it as a resource, and if you're in a position to donate, we always welcome that. This is what makes these types of events possible, which are open and free to the public. So without further ado, I will now introduce our two speakers. I will also be joining as a speaker, but my colleagues are Dr. Tamara Sears, who is an associate professor of art history at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on the art and architectural history of South Asia, with a particular focus on the Indian subcontinent. Her first book, called Worldly Gurus and Spiritual Kings, Architecture and Asceticism in Medieval India, was published by Yale University Press in 2014, and it received the Prose Award in Architecture and Urban Planning. She is currently completing a book that examines the relationship among architecture, environmental history, and travel on local, regional, and global scales. Her essays have appeared in many volumes and journals, including the Art Bulletin, Ars Orientalis, and Archives of Asian Art. And Dr. Sears' research has been supported by grants and fellowships from Fulbright, the Paul Getty Foundation, the National Humanities Center, Dumbarton Oaks, and the Clark Art Institute. And I would be remiss not to praise my colleague, Dr. Tamara Sears, for also being a leader in many of our collegial efforts here at Rutgers, and one of the leading figures in the Global Asian Studies program here at Rutgers, which is nationally known. Our next speaker, who is also a good friend and colleague, Dr. Asifa Qureshi-Landis, who specializes in comparative Islamic and constitutional law with a current focus on modern Islamic constitutional theory. She is a 2009 Carnegie Scholar and a 2012 Guggenheim Fellow. Her recent publications include, quote, Healing a Wounded Islamic Constitutionalism, Sharia, Legal Pluralism, and Unlearning the Nation-State Paradigm, which is forthcoming in the Transformative Constitutionalism book. And she's also the author of Legislating Morality and Other Illusions About Islamic Government, which is forthcoming in a book called Locating the Sharia, Legal Fluidity in Theory, History, and Practice. Professor Qureshi-Landis holds a doctorate from Harvard Law School and other degrees from Columbia Law School, the University of California, Davis, and the University of California, Berkeley, and served as law clerk in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Dr. Asifa Qureshi-Landis also served as a public delegate in the United Nations delegation to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, the Task Force on Religion, and the Making of U.S. Foreign Policy for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And she is past president of the National Association of Muslim Lawyers and serves on the governing board of the Association of American Law Schools section on Islamic law. So it goes without saying that Professor Qureshi-Landis is a very reputable and well-known scholar in Islamic law, and one of the few in the country. And we're so fortunate to have her expertise with us today and benefit from her knowledge. Okay, so I will start the lecture by providing kind of my perspective or my analysis, which will be more from the law and policy and Islamophobia angle. One of my areas of expertise is Islamophobia and civil rights against Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. And for those who would like to know more about that, I'll just put a plug in for my book, The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, which was published in 2022 with the University of California Press. So what I'll do, I'd like to first get started about, why are we having this lecture? What is it about this Hamline controversy that warrants a lecture on its own and many op-eds that have been written? Well, part of it was arising from the broader context of concerns and real concerns with Islamophobia post 9/11, which many of us committed our scholarly careers to. So that might be the broader impetus, but the specific case took place in Hamline University, which is a private liberal arts school, the oldest in Minnesota, and one that actually is remarkably diverse. I read a news article that stated that approximately 40% of their students were on Pell Grants. So clearly an accessibility school in that regards in terms of providing social mobility. And the case occurred, or the underlying facts occurred in November or the late October of 2022. Where Dr. Erica Lopez Prater, an adjunct professor at Hamline University, was teaching an online global arts history class. And in that class, she was showing art and paintings from all over the world. And she was intentionally wanting to include the Islamic art history portion of that class. And she's been cited in reports that she was very intentional in wanting to be inclusive about Islamic art history in her global art history class, which is a topic that is frequently marginalized and erased. But she also understood that many Muslims have deeply held religious beliefs that prohibit the depictions of the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him. So when she was teaching that class and she was showing the various Islamic art in her class, she wanted to make sure that she took many precautions before she showed a particularly one painting that is very famous, a 14th century painting. And she warned that the images of the holy figures, which included the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the angel Gabriel, and also paintings that showed the Buddha, she asked students to contact her if they had any concerns, and she said that no one did. This was what was reported. She also prepared the students or told them that in a few minutes, this is on the online class, that the painting would be displayed in case anyone wanted to leave the online class. And again, according to her, and this is based on publicly available news coverage, none of the students said anything at the time, and they remained in the online class. And she, in fact, did show the painting, which is one of the earliest Islamic illustrated histories of the world, called A Compendium of Chronicles, written during the 14th century by Rashid ad-Din. Now, after she showed the painting, this is after the class, one of the students, who was a senior, complained to the administration. And also other Muslim students who were not in the course supported that particular student, saying, according to them, claiming that the class was an attack on their religion, and they saw it as an act of hostility or discrimination, or that it was malicious. And here's where I think things went bad. And my view is, there is nothing wrong with the students complaining and expressing their concerns. Now, ideally, they should have gone to the professor, but in the case where perhaps they didn't feel comfortable of doing so, they went to the administrators, and students often will do that. But unfortunately, instead of going and speaking with the professor, the administration seems to have just kind of taken only the student's perspective and not been privy to all of the different precautions that the professor took to ensure, one, that the students understood that she was in no way attempting to insult them, and by showing the picture, she was not engaging in the Charlie Hebdo and the other types of malicious Islamophobic acts that intentionally portray the paintings of the Prophet as a way to insult Muslims. That was not at all her intent. She was being an academic who was just trying to make sure that she was comprehensive and accurate in her depictions of Islamic art history as part of her class. And effectively, the Dean of Students then sends an email on November 7th that condemned an unnamed classroom incident, and in quotes included in the email, an undeniably inconsiderate, disrespectful, and Islamophobic act. Now, there's something else that was going on at Hamline, which is that there had been persistence of anti-Black and anti-Black Muslim incidents. The students had been complaining for a while, independent of this class, prior to this class, that they were feeling unwelcome and they were experiencing hostility at the university, primarily from my understanding, again, from publicly available media, is that it was based on other students and engaging in anti-Black and anti-Muslim racism. So what appears to have been kind of an isolated incident seems to actually have been the figurative straw that broke the camel's back. And this is really what mobilized many of the students. And also, again, I don't agree with how the administration handled it, but it appears that the administration was responding overreaching in one particular incident when in fact the problem had been longstanding, and perhaps it was their failure to address the prior incidents of legitimate Islamophobia that triggered their kind of inappropriate response, at least according to my position. So just a few facts of what was also stated. The Hamline administration met with the leadership of the Muslim Student Association, and they devised a plan of action to address Islamophobia and other acts of intolerance on campus. Again, a legitimate effort. However, the professor was not included in those conversations. And this is where, I'll add a little bit about academic freedom in a minute. And they stated in this plan that in the future, bias and hate incidences, including those related to diversity, equity, inclusion, would be coordinated through the Office of Inclusion and Excellence, that there would be a new reporting form for incidents of campus bias, and that it would be made available to all members of the community. And that the leadership would continue to hold conversations with the Muslim Student Association members to discuss their experiences in the classroom and on campus. So again, this was part of a broader DEI initiative, and it's probably one of the few instances, unfortunately triggered by the wrong reason, but this is one of the few instances when DEI leaders are actually including Muslim students and including Middle Eastern students. In this case, these were Sudanese Muslim and Somali Muslim and African-American Muslim students, but this is one of the few incidences where they're actually included in DEI initiatives. And that's another broader structural problem at universities, is that Muslim students tend to be marginalized. Middle Eastern students who are Muslim and Christian tend to be completely invisible. And it's only when something bad happens or there's a crisis that then it becomes very reactionary. So I think that's an important point for us to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, a few other facts that I think are important here is the president of Hamline University is a Black woman. She is someone who's been there since 2015. The head of their DEI, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, is a Black man. And these are individuals who, at least based on what they've stated, are sincerely committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so part of what we also want to think about is how the increase in representational diversity can ensure that systems are deconstructed that otherwise those systems had not been serving minorities. And so what appears to me as a good faith attempt, right, to listen to the Black Muslim students ended up being so overreaching that then it infringed on the academic freedom of the professor. Now, there's another issue, which is the status of the professor. This professor was an adjunct, and I have an op-ed that I wrote that I would encourage you all to read if you kind of want to read some details, but that essentially argues that if she hadn't been an adjunct, if she had at least been tenured and possibly even tenure tracked, it wouldn't have been so easy for any administration to just dismiss her and not even include her in the conversations around the students' grievances. And in fact, she is one of tens of thousands of professors who are adjunct professors. So for example, let me just give you a little bit of data that I had included in my op-ed. In 2020, 2 out of every 4 faculty in the US were adjunct professors on short-term contracts with no guarantee of renewal. That's up to 50%. Adjuncts are paid a few $1,000s per class, and as a result, even when they work full-time, 25% of them are on public assistance, and approximately 40% of adjunct professors cannot pay for basic services. And all this is according to the American Federation of Teachers. Now, if you compare this with 1969, right, more than 60 years ago, 78% of faculty were tenure or tenure track, according to the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges. And in the 1970s, over 70% of public university budgets were covered by state and federal funding, and now it's only 34%. So this structural problem is that universities, both private have always been dependent on tuition, and Hamline is a private school, but this adjunctification of faculty is across the country, and public schools are getting hit the hardest because public schools used to rely on state funding, again, 70% of the budget. But now that difference, that almost 40% difference in what they used to receive from taxes, tax funding, what they now have to find in their budget is coming from tuition. And that has caused them to treat students as customers, and many of the students of this generation see universities as these vendors that are providing them a service that are no different than a telephone company or an internet company or an electricity company, when in fact universities are not and should not be treated as commercial entities. And what we provide is something that sometimes the quote unquote customer or the person who's paying for the service isn't necessarily qualified to say that's high quality or that's low quality, especially when we're talking about the content of what is being taught. So I don't think that we can separate, right, what's happening with the adjunctification of faculty from the academic freedom. And that's also intrinsically connected to how the Hamline University administration, again, in my view, mishandled the situation. And the mishandling was not that they went and listened to the students. The mishandling was not that they listened to the Muslim Students Association and met with them. It was that they didn't include the professor in that conversation, and that they didn't even hear the professor's perspective and treat the professor as an equal and a member of the educational community. And I would love to say that that doesn't happen to tenured professors, but it does as well. But tenure protects you from that you at least don't suffer from job insecurity as a result. And academic freedom is threatened by this commercialization of higher education, regardless whether you're tenured or untenured. It's just the consequences are different insofar as what the administration can do. So I will, and then finally, I just want to make a few points before I turn it over to Dr. Sears, is I just want to highlight why, some factual context of why it may be completely reasonable for these Muslim students to have considered a painting of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to be of malicious intent. Again, I don't believe that's the case here, but I just want to bring up some facts. Muslims in colleges today have only known a post 9/11 America, right? Where the US president, congressional leaders, and the media have constantly portrayed Muslims as terrorists. Islam is a violent political ideology, and the government has killed millions of Muslims in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen without accountability. So they are rightfully suspicious of non-Muslims' intentions where a non-Muslim shows the picture of a Prophet Mohammed, because they remember Charlie Hebdo in 2015, when this French paper was intentionally asking for people to portray the Prophet, who is somebody who is, a very important religious figure for 1.8 billion people across the world, to intentionally display him as a terrorist, as a pedophile, as a bad, evil person. They also remember that there was in Garland, Texas, same year in 2015, that the Curtis Curwell Center, which was motivated by the Draw Muhammad context in Garland, Texas, was sponsored by and organized by the Anti-Islam American Freedom Defense Initiative, and led by the former journalist Pamela Geller, and also the face, and Pamela Geller is very well known for her anti-Muslim and Islamophobic views, and she's very proud of them. And also you had the Faces of Muhammad cartoon contest hosted by the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten in 2005. So all of these things, this generation of college students is very aware of. And there is it's reasonable for them to presume that if someone wants to show a picture of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that they may have ill intent. Again, that was not the case here, but it's just so that people understand there is a rationale to that sensitivity. And I will leave it to my colleague, Professor Asifa Qureshi-Landis, to explain the theological and socio-legal and religious bases for kind of the controversies, but I just wanted to bring out this political component. Okay, and with that, I'm going to now pass it to Dr. Tamara Sears to discuss the artistic. She is an expert on art history and obviously in South Asia, which includes many Islamic societies. So I will pass it on to her. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sahar. And I have to say that just to give you some background, I am an art historian, and I'm not specifically an Islamicist, but I always often teach Islam as part of my broader, I teach South Asia and also Asia more broadly. And what I wanted to talk about today is a little bit different. I think there's been a lot that has been written on the specific image that was shown in class. I will say that it is part of a lot of global art surveys, so it's not outrageous image to teach in at least art historical terms. It's part of the larger canon and has been incorporated as part of DEI initiatives of inclusion diversity as a very standard and almost canonical. I mean, it in fact represents an effort and a desire on the part of art history as a discipline to incorporate more diversity into the canon of art history by choosing works that were deemed within their own historical context as highly significant and highly important. So it's not in some ways it's ironic that the work has spurred such controversy right now, because the intention in including it at all was one of trying to diversify the way in which we understand, particularly medieval and early modern history. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit now is a little bit about what we do as art historians, and also some of the issues that I encounter in dealing with how to incorporate Islamic art into my teaching on South Asia more specifically, because I think that as art historians, it's what we do is often misunderstood, is sort of seen as teaching students how to appreciate art and its aesthetic qualities. I mean, we are often we are historians, and the difference between art historians and historians who work more traditionally in history departments is that is our point of departure. We start with images, objects, buildings, landscapes, and from there move into textual sources in order to understand images, architecture, objects, and so forth. Not so much as we might experience them today, but as they might have been intended, and as their meanings might have been intended within the context within which they were made. In part, I see this as an important, and one of the reasons I became an art historian is I see this as a very important task, because images, objects, and spaces can evoke very powerful responses, and through studying them, teaching them, one can cultivate empathy to encourage students and colleagues to begin to imagine a world and imagine a perspective that is rooted in values and associations and meanings that are not necessarily the ones that we hold today. And so that is one of the, I think, one of the most important things about dealing with images, is to understand how they were meant at the moment at which they were made. It's very different from, for example, images that are made to offend specifically today in today's context. But to see an image that meant something at a particular moment, it's extremely important to think about why it was made. And so I think that the idea of cultivating empathy and understanding of communities as they existed in the past, not just as they existed today, is, I think, also essential to understanding the intellectual and social roots of who we are today. So these are not two disconnected histories, but that we emerge from those. And I think that it also is very important in helping us confront the ways in which, like, the kind of shifts that led to changes in how we might encounter or engage images. Why is that image so controversial today? That question, I think, is just as important to ask as whether or not it should be shown. Is, you know, the whole controversy and the question of why it is that's an image that was considered to be extremely important and canonical at a certain moment might be seen so differently by certain communities today is, I think, a very important question that we always are asking. So one of the things we do as art historians, and I wanted to bring in a couple of images of my own to give you a sense for what we do and why it matters, and why it is that, you know, when we look at images that were produced in the past, we need to actually see them through a lens that might not, you know, seem automatic, that we need to learn how to, I'm assuming you can see the image screen, the PowerPoint screen correctly. Is that correct? Okay, good. So I wanted to start with an image like this, which is a very famous image from the Padchanama, which is a 17th century manuscript done for the Emperor Shah Jahan. And it is one of those quintessential and, you know, high moments in Indo-Islamic and Mughal painting that is also often heralded as a way of seeing the kind of incorporation and influence of European art on Mughal painting. And scholars initially encountering this painting pointed to the sort of typical flatness of the backdrop here, but then to this slight incursion or slight insertion of things like perspectival space that, that art historians initially, when they initially engaged this painting, attributed to the increasing familiarity of Mughal artists with European Renaissance approaches to perspective, and saw this as a kind of forward movement, a progressive movement in the development of Islamic art in South Asia. More recently, Abakok, who's one of the major scholars of Islamic painting, has pointed out actually that this kind of interpretation is actually wrong. So from our perspective, looking today, we might look at this and say, oh yeah, this looks like a more advanced approach to depicting space in painting using shading and perspective and linear perspective. But in fact, what she pointed out is that if we look at it from the vantage point of the 17th century of what mattered, this is the way that an ideal court should be depicted. This sense of perspective here, in fact, what she started pointing out is that this painting here was actually, and the insertion of perspective was a tongue-in-cheek effort by painters to critique the court of Shah Jahan's predecessor, the Emperor Jahangir, who is seen here. So these are both part of the same manuscript. They appear in the same place. You'll notice that there's no use of linear perspective here at all. And you'll notice that in this case, Shah Jahan is the emperor, and he's a grown man. In this painting, he's depicted as a young child receiving an ornament from his father, the Emperor Jahangir. And in fact, he and his father did not get along at all. In fact, and he lived the last years of Jahangir's reign. Shah Jahan lived in exile. He fled the court for fear of his father. And so what she argued is that from the vantage point, a good, orderly, ethical kingdom should be depicted in this manner here, without the excessive insertion of European forms of perspective. Whereas this image here and the insertion of European, it was a way of actually pointing out the excesses of Jahangir's court. And you'll notice, in this depiction of flowers, there's no symmetry, there's no geometry. It's all sort of sliding around. And so part of what we do as art historians is we train students to take a look at what they might assume, given their vantage point, the assumptions that we would make about what we're seeing in the present day, and challenge them to think about what mattered, how images would have been read, would have been understood at the moment at which they were created. And that's often not the same as the way in which we might naturally decipher them or decode them today. So in teaching Islamic art within the context of South Asia, one of the things I often encounter two challenges. Those of you who've been following the news for the last 20 or 30 years know that there have been increasing moments of communal violence in India, particularly between Hindus and Muslims, and there have been increasing efforts to essentially reframe Indian history through a Hindu nationalist framework in ways that begin to excise or mitigate the impact or the role that that Islam has played in the production of Indian cultural forms, and certainly which were certainly significant, as you can see from these manuscripts. From my vantage point, this makes teaching Islamic art in South Asia, in the context of South Asia, difficult from many perspectives, but I'm going to highlight two here. One is, I think about this two historical moments where it's particularly difficult for me, or particularly challenging for me to frame Islam in the context of Indian art and architectural history. And the first is the moment of the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century, which is the first moment where we begin to have imperial or a large and powerful Islamic state within the Indian subcontinent. The thing that makes this challenging is that it feeds into contemporary narratives of conquest and destruction, which pit Muslims as quote unquote foreign invaders who disrupted an overly idyllic notion of a kind of homogenous pre-Islamic Indian, geography. And in fact, actually, these histories, pre-Islamic histories within India were more complicated. India was never really, and certainly not in the 13th century, a homogenous Hindu state. It was a politically contested space where you had multiple rulers and multiple kings patronizing a wide range of competing religious groups, all of which today would be classified as broadly Hindu, but which at the time would not necessarily have seen themselves as being grouped into the same homogenous religion. They had different rituals, and they did not necessarily agree on the relative supremacy of key gods. There were also other religious communities living in India. There were Jains, Buddhists, there were tribal and village practices that were not Brahmanical, and they had their own internal logics and spheres of influence. And we see, so we see that, that it was a very heterogeneous place. It was not the kind of unified vision of a kind of Hindu nation, which is often promulgated by Hindu nationalists today. And in fact, the period around the 12th and 13th century was a period of a power vacuum, which saw the weakening of North Indian imperial rulers, which gave rise to a lot of competition among regional rulers who were trying to consolidate power and extend kingdoms across regional lines. And we have many inscriptions which give us examples well into the 13th and 14th century, well after the establishment of the first Delhi sultans, of earlier so-called Hindu dynasties competing with each other and going into battle with each other in order to expand the scope of their respective kingdoms. We also see destruction throughout as a way of asserting power among Hindu rulers. So a lot of the narratives, you have these Muslim rulers who come in and destroy earlier Hindu temples. But in fact, actually, I mean, first of all, that's an exaggerated. Many of those accounts are not only vastly exaggerated, but it also elides the fact that this was a practice that also was undertaken by earlier Hindu rulers. And I'm showing you a very famous example from the famous site of Khajuraho of this a temple known as Lakshmana temple that was built by a king named Yashovarman, who, according to the inscription that's installed within it, tells us that he built this temple in order to enshrine an image that he had taken in battle from a temple that had been built by his imperial overlord at a different place. So this practice of capturing temples and taking the icons out of temples and then installing them into new temples as a way of asserting conquest was something that was practiced by many rulers, even within what we would see as the same religion. Other examples, so sort of so other examples, so examples of, the Islamic reuse or the sort of seeming forms of destruction have been sort of begun to be reinterpreted more fruitfully as following longer running patterns of reuse. And I'm showing you here 2 early Sultanate era monuments that reused elements from earlier monuments within the Indian subcontinent. In this case, an 4th or 5th century iron pillar, probably from a temple to Vishnu that had long fallen out of use, reinstalled quite famously in a mosque built in the 12th century. This is, these examples like this have been often described again by Hindu nationalists as examples of Muslim destruction of earlier monuments. But the bottom line is that this was a pattern that was not that, again, it was a part of a vocabulary of power that was utilized also by earlier Hindu kings. And I show you this example here. This is Barry Flood has written extensively about this, of a earlier of a 3rd century BC pillar that was reused in a 14th century Indo-Islamic fort. But if you look carefully at the pillar, there's also inscriptions. A Sanskrit, here's the 3rd century inscription here, and a 12th century inscription in Sanskrit recording the conquest of Delhi by a Hindu prince, an earlier Hindu prince, after he had conquered it from another Hindu dynasty. So this act of reusing elements of earlier buildings was something that can't be seen really fruitfully as something that was simply about the Muslim conquest. It was part of a larger vocabulary and practice engaged by rulers throughout India as a way of establishing authority over earlier places. And so, as Barry Flood and others have argued, that this is a practice that was into which that the new Sultanate rulers were engaging in. It was an earlier practice that they then incorporated into their own practice. How am I doing on time? I just want to make sure. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to move forward a little bit. So the other thing I wanted to say is that when I do teach a material, I always have problems with periodization. I'm always wary of dividing up my survey courses at the 13th century line in an effort to sort of not reinforce this idea of destruction and disruption. And we do see many continuities and practices in many Indo-Islamic monuments. I'm showing you 2 ceilings. This is an earlier Jain temple. You can see the ceiling patterns in this Friday Mosque complex were produced by artisans who are well schooled in this technique. So there's these continuities that are worth often bringing out. So the other major moment that is very difficult and very challenging often to articulate is the very contemporary moment over the last 20 years, when and to think about the way in which, and this is when we start getting to the 1990s and 2000s, the era after the destruction of the Babri Masjid or Babri Mosque in Ayodhya by Hindu nationalists operating under the belief, and I should say a mistaken belief, that it was built on an ancient temple dedicated to the Hindu god Ram. And this led to many attacks on Muslim artists. Here I'm showing you actually K.G. Subramanian, who's not a Muslim artist, Hindu artist, but who was utilizing, it had been up until through the late 80s. He stopped doing this in the 1990s because he felt like utilized that religious imagery started taking on new meanings in the 1990s. But he had until then been drawing off of this long, rich history of religious imagery in order to articulate a layered history for the present and a secularist vision for the present. So drawing off of the richness of this visual vocabulary and to articulate new meanings. Sanjay Subramaniam has not had too much difficulty, but Ahmed Hussain, who is an artist originally of Muslim descent, has had to effectively renounce his Indian citizenship and leave the country under great fear of personal threat. His engagements with earlier religious imagery, and I should note that he engaged with many different religious imageries: Hindu, Christian, Muslim, and so forth, and has written extensively about how he drew upon all of these histories in order to begin to try to express, as an act of paying homage and admiration, he ultimately came under attack again by Hindu nationalists who claimed that his works offended the sensibilities of Hindus. At the heart of the controversy around his work was this particular image of, which was dubbed after the fact Mother India. He in fact left this image untitled. The collector who purchased this gave it the name Mother India. And this image was one of the major images that caused a tremendous amount of controversy, for which he was charged with offending the sensibilities of Hindus. And so this is, again, this problem of showing controversial imagery that may or may not have been intended as controversial at the time. And in fact, M.F. Hussein's intention in producing this image was not to offend the sensibilities of Hindus. In fact, this is a depiction of India as a female figure, in this case, drawing off of sculptural imagery from medieval India, classical Indian sculpture, and wrapping her body around the subcontinent. The wheel here is drawn from Buddhist imagery, and you'll notice the geography extends up into areas that were torn by partition. This, in many ways, was M.F. Hussein's articulation and vision of a unified India, an India that could transcend the communal conflicts that had been causing so much violence at the moment at which it was created. There were major riots in 2002 in Gujarat, which led to a tremendous amount of violence. And so this is in some ways his vision of unity. And in fact, the primary reason why it was seen as offending the sensibilities of Hindus had to do with the fact that this image had been appropriated in many ways by Hindu nationalists who had begun to see India as a personification of a Hindu goddess. This was not at all the genealogy of this image. This is an appropriation. And in fact, the kind of earlier genealogy of envisioning India as a female figure was not, in fact, Hindu. It goes back to the early 20th century. This very famous painting by Abanindranath Tagore, who envisioned the god India as a subcontinent as a secular goddess, holding, utilizing both Hindu iconography drawn from Hinduism, but the emblems that she holds are there's wheat and cotton, a book indicating sort of India's spiritual history, but utilizing the visual vocabulary of Mughal painting. So in fact, M.F. Hussein in his image was drawing off of this kind of genealogy from an early kind of nationalist moment, one that saw the multiplicity of religions within India as being the root and the foundation, the multicultural diversity of India as being its fundamental strength. And so in some ways, again, just as it's, we need to think about the kind of ways in which images were intended, meant to be seen, and the meanings that get attached to them at different moments and for different political purposes. I think we need to always question why it is that an image is controversial, and when it is controversial, to begin to think about whether or not there are other ways to see it. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sears. That was very informative. And a few just ideas that came up in my head was, the important point is the fact that you need to be able to even have these discussions, right, in class, and allow these types of debates, even if students may agree or disagree with the way that you interpret it or the different alleged motivations behind painting these paintings and the historical facts surrounding them. I think we all know that's where the core of academic freedom lies, right? The ability to even do that. And teach students that we must be able to do that, to go through that process in order to properly educate them and teach them how to critically think and not necessarily agree, right? Critical thinking doesn't mean you must agree with the professor. It just means that you need to be able to at least analyze and understand the facts and all of the other information that you need to know in order to support your case, even if your position is in disagreement with the professor. So with that, I want to pass it to, and we'll go through it.
Yeah. Can I add one thing? I just wanted to say that I would love classrooms to be spaces where students can say, I feel offended, and then we can have a conversation about that, as opposed to them being spaces where students remain mute and then later on launch a campaign. We should be having those conversations in class.
I agree. I totally agree. And all of us are professors, so we do have that that positional bias in our favor. I'll now pass it on to Professor Qureshi Landis. The floor is yours.
Thank you. That was a good segue to what I'm going to talk about, which is a lot about diversity. But first, I want to say thank you, Tamara. My genetic heritage goes back to India, Pakistan, and actually to the court of Jahangir. So it was really nice to get a little taste of the art of my heritage. So thank you very much. Yes, I teach Islamic law classes on Islamic law. I also teach constitutional law. So there's lots of controversy. There's lots of rip from the headlines issues in all of my classes. And when Sahar asked me to come and join us, she said, talk a little bit about the difference of opinion on some of these things. And as I started to jot down a list, I was like, wait, it would be easier to make a list of what there isn't a disagreement on, because almost everything there's a difference of opinion within Islamic law. So that's sort of the beginning of how I teach my class, that the entire epistemology of how the scholars went about articulating God's law was all a process of where they acknowledge their human fallibility in the process. And therefore, that's how we have so many different schools of law. Muslims here will know the madhab. The word madhab means path or way. So all of the way that Muslims live and follow Islam is really going to depend on which school of thought they follow, in addition to the cultural and ethnic and language diversity that you see around the world and throughout history. So just for a taste, I put down just a few topics that when I teach my class, people get surprised, especially Muslims in the class, because they may not have heard some of these differences of opinion. So one very recent topic that's been in the news is the topic of abortion. There are multiple views within Islamic law on when life begins, ranging from 0 to 40 days to 80 days to 120 days after conception. And all of that leads to very different opinions on when and how and where and what appropriate circumstances it might be to have an abortion. Lots of difference of opinion. This is something that some people are surprised to hear. The rules of marriage and divorce. There's a lot of difference in the access to divorce, who can marry off who in the family. Some of these rules have a lot of disadvantage to women, but on the other hand, there's quite a lot of pieces of these puzzles that's quite empowering and centering women's autonomy and financial independence. A lot of that is a surprise to some of my students when I talk about that in class. The topic of adultery and prosecutions for adultery. You've heard probably in the news of adultery prosecutions based on an unwed pregnancy. Well, that turns out to be something that there's difference of opinion as well. One school allows for that kind of a prosecution, but the others don't. Topic of slavery is back in the news, sadly, with human trafficking and everything. And many Muslims are surprised to find out that actually fiqh doctrine, the doctrine of Sharia, never ban slavery. The fiqh rules of property include the idea of owning another human being. And there are arguments against that, but it exists in the literature, and that bothers some people when you start talking about that. Closer to our topic today, the rules on music and what kind of music is acceptable to listen to or not listen to. Some of you might know the evolution of Cat Stevens on this topic. He himself went through various understandings of what he could do as a Muslim as he encountered this topic, and a very talented musician that I think we all love. And then on this topic of drawings and depictions of figures in general, but then also figures especially of prophets and of God especially. This is a huge area of lots of different interpretation. I do not have time to go into any of it. I can just tell you that there are many different interpretations of the various sayings of the prophet and the authenticity of that, and how much that gives you a legal rule on whether or not you can draw a figure, the idea being a face, something with a face. And what does that mean, as opposed to drawing geometric images or other kinds of floral images? You saw a lot in what Dr. Sears was just showing us, that there's a lot of art that includes figures, and then there's a lot of art that doesn't. And the incredible calligraphy history largely comes, I think, from and art historian can tell us, from pushing into other forms of art when you're not doing depictions of figures. So the history of Islamic art is quite diverse, and there's difference of interpretation on whether or not you can draw a figure at all. And even if you can draw a figure, whether you can draw a figure of the Prophet. So the piece that was shown in Hamline, as we know, is part of a long history. And I find it interesting that it was commissioned by a ruler, because I, from my constitutional knowledge, know that most rulers had advisors advising them on the Islamicity, the fiqh legitimacy of what they were doing. So it's possible that he actually consulted with somebody on this even. So there was even more of just, rather than he was just doing it, but actually there was a lot of scholarly thought on this. So all of that is just a taste of the kinds of things that I bring into my classroom. And so my reaction when I saw this story was, as a teacher, of things that are controversial, of things that are a surprise to Muslim students. Non-Muslim students are surprised that there's so much nuance to Islamic law. Islamic law is often presented as a monolith, that there's one view. I usually tell people, if somebody tells you the Islamic law is X, you should be very suspicious, because probably they're not telling you the whole story. Most things have multiple interpretations. But the stereotype of Islamic law out there is that there's one, and then it's rigid, and it's the one that I heard. And that goes for non-Muslims and Muslims. So if I'm sitting in a classroom and I'm teaching things about Islamic law that are different than what the student has heard about Islamic law, that can cause a little bit of an earthquake in their mind. And it can feel sometimes even offended. If I've been told that Islam is only one thing, the Sunday school version I got, or the version that my mother taught, or something like this, it really is shaking if you hear something quite different than that, because you've been told Islam is only one thing. So it's a lot of my job as an educator of the actual diversity of Islamic legal history to show them that there is diversity. You don't have to agree with all of it, but that it exists and why. And I spent a lot of time on legal theory, articulating and getting the students to really engage with the methodologies of interpretation, understand why they ended up in different places, and then you can pick whatever you want. But if I were to restrict what I teach based on what my students, any of the students, think is contrary to their understanding of Islamic law, I wouldn't be able to teach anything. For one, they all have different understandings, so which one am I going to teach? But also, we tend to live in very siloed experiences right now. So we hear one version of a lot of things. And this goes beyond Islamic law. This goes to American history. It's in the news right now, controversy over how American history is taught. We just heard diversity of interpretations of what Indian history is and who is in charge and doing what in Indian history. I know my story of Indian history that I heard from my father is very different from what my cousins are getting right now in Jaipur. So how we understand what happened often depends on what bubble we live in how we learn. And I see going into a university classroom as an opportunity to hear other narratives and understand a variety of other storytelling about things that I might have heard about. And so it is the job of a university professor, of an administration, to facilitate and make that a safe space where people can say, this bothers me, and we can talk about that. It's my job as a teacher to make sure that it's respectful and with people are operating with integrity and not insulting each other, the teacher and the students to each other. I just taught constitutional law too, and I taught race discrimination, abortion, same-sex marriage, and sex discrimination. I mean, every single controversial topic in the news right now was in my class last semester. It was a tough semester. People got really upset, and this is on both sides of the political spectrum. We're hearing things that made them very uncomfortable. And I did my best to keep it, bringing all the ideas in there, because I don't think it's my job. I don't think I've done my job well if a student encounters an idea for the first time outside of my classroom. If it has to do with my topic, they should have heard about it in my classroom. It's my job to expose them to it and deal with it in a safe, respectful way and bring all those ideas together. And it is very difficult sometimes. Sometimes there are some things that do not belong in a classroom. And sometimes that's a hard call. And it calls for a lot of analysis of what's the educational value here versus any potential harm that could come out. But the decision should not be based on the emotional feelings of the students. That's too subjective. There's no way to have that be our standard. It's too much influenced by our own, bubbles that we live in. And so this is where I think Hamline might have gone too fast. The administration seems to have taken just the word of a few people on what crosses the line for appropriateness. And honestly, I think a little bit of believing that Islamic law is one thing, which is part of the problem because it really isn't. And so one version was presented to them and said, okay, that's the one version, but also not really wrestling with the complicated job of figuring out what is valuable and how to do it in a place where you're talking about things that are difficult, and how to do this in a way that educates everybody and focuses on the education. All of that, in addition to the points that Sahar just made earlier about there seems to have been other harms before this. This seems to have been the last straw. And I really am curious about more background, because nothing happens in a vacuum. So if a community or even a person is feeling respected and included and honored as full member of society, then you're less likely to feel marginalized by an event like this. And so when you're exposed to the ideas in the classroom, it's not going to be seen as just one more message of othering. It's going to be seen in context of what it is the teacher's trying to do. So it seems like Hamline took a little bit of a shortcut here to appeasing a particular firestorm that they were dealing with and sacrificing an adjunct professor, because it's easy to sacrifice an adjunct professor, rather than dealing with what is all the marginalization that these students are feeling that's leading them to feel like this. And that's unfair to students, and it's unfair to teachers. Because if we are the ones there on the front lines dealing with this controversial stuff and trying to help our students see all these different things that are disturbing and bothersome, but trying to keep an environment where everyone can learn from that experience, if a teacher comes into a situation not knowing that the students are already in an environment where they feel under attack and feel destabilized, then it's unfair to the teacher not knowing that that's the environment the students are swimming in, so that what I'm doing is not going to be taken on its face. It's going to be taken as part of a narrative that I had nothing to do with. And that's a huge obstacle for teachers being able to do our job. Our job as educators in a diverse and polarized society is more important now than ever. And we need everybody having our back to help us and support us in doing this and not making it harder and not sacrificing us when things get tough. So that's my take on the whole story. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for taking time to attend today's lecture, Protecting Academic Freedom, Empowering Muslim Students After the Hamline Controversy. It was my distinct honor to moderate and to serve on this panel with Professor Asifa Qureshi-Landis and Professor Tamara Sears. And I thank Rutgers University Newark because it is one of the few university campuses that is true to its social justice mission. It is one of the most diverse universities in the country and has been so since the 90s, so something they should be proud of. I'm also grateful to my colleagues at Rutgers in New Brunswick. And before you leave, please do check out the Center for Security, Race, and Rights' website. Go to our events and attend our next lectures. We have 2 more this semester. One is featuring Professor Hiba Gawayed, who wrote an excellent book called Refuge: How the State Shapes Human Potential. She'll be speaking in a virtual lecture on February 20th, and that is eligible for CLE credits for the lawyers in the audience. And then we have Professor George Bisharat on March 30th, who will be talking about the international human rights movement that has focused specifically on Palestinian human rights over the past decades. And that is sadly still a very hot topic for us who are focused on international law and international relations. And so with that, I want to thank you to both of my co-panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules and sharing your expertise. And thank you to the audience, and we'll see you at our next lecture, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Bye-bye. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bye.